Introductions. My name is Kathy Cowling. I've met most of you, but not all of you. I am a member at Trinity Episcopal Church in Oshkosh and a member of the CCB team, and have done work for the Episcopal Church in a variety of capacities for about 30 years. So I'm happy to be with you all today.
She didn't tell you, she used to be the canon for congregational development in the Diocese of Minnesota. Formation. So we are blessed to have her expertise. I'm Joanne Skidmore. I am a retired priest now of this diocese, and I come with expertise from having spent 22 years in the military and retired as a senior officer. So some of the time my language might be more from that venue, but I've done a lot of work in congregational development, as has Kathy. So the key is, without direction or a plan, without checking ourselves where we are, we could be headed to Aruba but end up in Anchorage. Now, I love that because I love Anchorage. And I could have a great time getting to the wrong location. So if we aren't doing good planning, if we aren't getting a lay of the land as we travel, if we aren't checking and saying, wait a minute, are we on track? Where are we going off track? Where might we need to adjust? I could end up in a wrong place. Great time getting there, but if we had something we needed to do, we'd be in the wrong location. So to me, it's very important that we pay attention not just to planning and at the end evaluation, but also that journey in between. So anytime we have any visioning or mission work, setting of goals, any kind of process, it's important we plan, check ourselves as we go, and then evaluate. So our goal today, so that hopefully you'll end up where you want to be and not in a lovely place but not where you intended. So our goal is to understand the life cycles of congregations and the impact it has on visioning, to help discover ways to be intentional about vision and direction, and discuss ways to structure. Our church structures can help or hinder us in that journey. And then talk about the importance of discernment, planning, execution, and assessment. So I have some questions, and I'm just going to ask you to raise your hand and to keep it up as long as the statements apply. So raise your hand if your congregation has a mission and or vision statement. Keep it up if you can approximately state it. So fairly close, not just, and then keep your hands up if your vision and mission statement form, inform, and drive everything that happens at your parish. That the vestry and leadership are using that to make decisions about programs and money and planning. So we have a few. So I have another question, and this one we're going to ask for you to speak up. What are the biggest challenges in your congregation to articulating and implementing a vision? Just simple statements. What challenges do congregations face?
Manpower.
Manpower.
Yeah. Not everybody agreeing with it and working with it.
Not everyone not on board.
Not on board.
Ignoring it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Ambivalence.
Ambivalence.
Too generic.
Too generic.
No plan to execute.
No plan to execute. We're going to let Kathy catch up.
Get caught up.
I'm missing one. Manpower, not everyone on board, too generic.
Ambivalence.
Yeah, wasn't there one more?
No plan to execute.
No plan to execute. Thank you.
Others.
People with a consumerist mentality
I just come to church for what I want, and that's it. That may be a little, maybe,
Apathy.
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 What's it gonna get me?
I would add to the list, we've done it. It can sit on a shelf,
We've tried that before.
which kind of goes to the apathy.
Busy lifestyles.
Busy lifestyles.
Somebody else came up with the idea.
It's not,
Not mine.
It's not mine.
ownership.
Yeah, ownership is.
Ownership, yeah, lack of ownership, that is. Any others? So you can see that visioning and mission work is not simple. You have a lot of barriers you have to think about as you plan and implement your vision and mission. And to consider those kinds of things. How will we overcome apathy or ambivalence? How will we get people on board? Those types of things are things you have to assess up front and have a plan for. You ready?
Mm-hmm. Before we get into some of the specifics on mission, I want to talk a little bit about the life cycle of the congregation. So this may be old hat for a number of you, and for some of you it might be new. But it's important when we talk about planning and visioning because it impacts and it addresses some of the challenges that congregations face. Congregations, like individual people, like lots of organisms, has a life cycle. There's a moment in time when the congregation is born, when it is formed, and then there's a period of growth. And this time is usually really exciting in the life of a congregation. For most of us, my congregation was formed, in the 1850s? My community is a long time away from that birth and growth narrative. And if you're in a congregation with a longer life, you too are away from that birth narrative in the congregation. But eventually congregations reach a time of stability. So where things are cruising along, we've reached a level where there's people coming, we're doing programs, we're doing ministry, life is pretty good. What often happens, though, is if we kind of rest in that place of stability, we eventually become stagnant. And if that is not addressed, then the congregation over time slips into decline. And if that isn't addressed, it slips further into decline and will eventually die. And that sometimes happens with congregations. And they've happened in this diocese where we've had to close congregations and in other dioceses as well. And so there's there's kind of three opportunities when you look at this model of helping the congregation get back into that place of looking at growth and once again moving into a new period of stability. The first one is that red circle. And ideally when things are going well, it is a time to look at redefining our mission. It's a time of saying, things are going great, we're not going to rest in that, we're going to continue to discern what God is calling us to next. When congregations have slipped, though, beyond stability into the early stages of decline, Then what's required is more of redevelopment. Sometimes the word revitalization gets used as well. And as a congregation is more deeply into decline, then the options become either we are going to really radically change and to be reborn, or we're going to die as a congregation. And so understanding where your congregation is in its present life cycle is going to be important as you look at what's the work of visioning, of discerning where God is calling you to be, and looking at your direction for the future. Because it will, each of these different processes of redefinition, redevelopment, rebirth have different kinds of challenges. And so it's important to know where you're at with those. And by the way, your handouts have all these slides, so you can go ahead and follow along, but also as you have questions, let me know. Just don't get to raise your hand. So there are three foundational questions that every congregation at that stage of growth needs to ask itself. And the first question is, who are we? What's our identity? The second question is, who is our neighbor? Was speaking to who has God planted us amongst? And in other words, kind of the harvest out there. Who are we around? And then, why are we here? As churches get settled into stability, they tend to be pretty comfortable and stay focused on questions number 1 and 3. And tend to become less focused on that second question of who is our neighbor. And as that second question gets ignored or has less emphasis, the energy of a congregation tends to turn more inward. And it is when that inward focus becomes dominant that congregations begin to slip more and more into decline. So when you think about the life cycle and what follows stability, there are two options. One is to redefine the ministry and then leading to that new growth cycle. And the second one is to move further into decline. The piece that's important to think about and to realize that depending on where your congregation is if you're at some point in that downward slope toward decline, the further down you are, the greater the challenge it is to revision and to have new life and growth in the congregation. It's not impossible, but it's important to be realistic about what those challenges are. Unchecked, decline only leads to more decline. It's going to continue on that cycle without an intentional halt to it and some attention to look at shifting that. And there's a couple of things that's important to acknowledge because it's just human nature. The first thing is that we underestimate the degree of the decline. I still come to church, worship is meaningful to me, I have friends here, it's a wonderful community, and so it's easy to be blindsided or to not be as focused as to what the degree of the decline has occurred. And then the second piece, again, this is because of human nature, is to then under-respond to addressing the decline.
And so just real briefly about what each of these loops look like. So under renewal or redefinition, that first loop, so if you're still pretty stable, life is good, that's the time to start thinking about, we need to be discerning where we go next. And not to get kind of into that comfortable space of, we can just coast along. Congregations at this stage are still pretty outwardly focused. And one of the questions that we've been asking congregations when we've done the CCV visit is, what would be missed if your congregation no longer existed? What's the impact that you have in the community beyond yourselves? And that helps identify or articulate what the outward focus is of your congregation. And so at times when you're at this point of stability and you're not quite getting stagnant yet, is the time to return to those three foundational questions. And then to remember that adaptability is going to be key for looking at how it is you move back into that loop toward revisioning and growth. So that vitality and renewal are marked by a degree of adaptability. And obviously that there's a willingness to engage in ongoing renewal. So that piece around, oh, we've already done this. We already did our mission statement. Why are we having to do this again? It is one that has to get addressed at this level. But this is an opportunity for congregations to begin to do some strategic planning. And again, to address the two challenges of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And so one of the things that is key to beginning to articulate or discern where God is calling you next as a congregation, what God has in mind for us, is one, to talk about and realize that we're called always to be in discernment. It's not just something we do every 5 years or whenever we're ready to get a new priest, but that is something that the church is called to do as part of our discipline, as part of our life. And the other piece is that, again, it's that tendency to underestimate, if you're instability and you're starting to get a little too comfortable, a little too stagnant, it's to really get comfortable in that space of denial or life is good, we don't have to do this. And so you might undertake a process, but it might not address some of those issues. Redevelopment, that cycle where there's a bit more decline. A key way to begin to assess whether your congregation is at that is, has the energy turned inward? Are you focused more on maintenance and preservation than you are on being Christ's hands and feet in the world? It's that piece going back to the Great Commission, or to the way our prayer book talks about the mission of the church to restore all in unity to God in Christ. And if we're focused more on keeping the building open and propped up and the roof on, or preserving what we have, and the focus becomes more inward to the life of the community, that's a sign that decline has begun to slip in. The piece that is hard sometimes for congregations to realize is that when there's decline and you're needing to do some visioning and some redevelopment, that you're not just needing new information, but that a change is required. And that may be a change in purpose as well as a change in direction. And so again, kind of going back to those three foundational questions of who who are we, who is our neighbor, and why are we here, that question around purpose and identity might really begin to be challenged for the congregation. And the thing to keep in mind is that this requires more time and energy. The further your congregation moves into decline. And so for congregations who think, oh, you know, at a vestry meeting or at a vestry retreat, yeah, we came up with the mission and vision statement. To really begin to get the congregation to own that is a much more lengthy process. It's not something that just happens in a day or two. One of the things that churches often think about when they're at this stage of decline and redevelopment is to think that, oh gee, okay, we're calling a new priest and that's going to change things. That may or may not change things. But it doesn't, a change in leadership does not necessarily redirect the congregation from where it's at here. And the thing that's important to remember for congregations as you do your visioning and thinking about where is God calling you to be, that especially if you're moving on somewhere on that decline slope, is that there are two illusions that we get hooked into that cause trouble all the time. One is we think that we can grow without changing. And the second one is to think that we can change and not have conflict. And so I think part of what often prevents churches to really think about doing that discernment of what is God calling us to be and to do in this time and place, if it requires us to change, we don't want to rock the boat. We don't want to lose people. We don't want to make people unhappy. And the reality is that you cannot grow without change, and you cannot change without there being conflict. And so part of the key that I think is really important for leadership to not only be aware of and talk about, but also to engage with the congregation with, is that reality. And how is it that we best kind of prepare ourselves for that? The rebirth is for, again, congregations that are way down at decline. The congregation is kind of congealed. It's gotten really stuck. And again, preserving the status quo and really focused on its own survival has become key. And if congregations are stuck on their survival, then it's an opportunity to re-engage with the gospel. We have to remember that the more decline there is, the more change that's going to be required. But the thing, and this kind of goes back to what Carrie was talking this morning about how it is that we root ourselves, how it is that we really kind of engage ourselves with the gospel. Because as resurrection people, we know that resurrection comes out of death. Resurrection doesn't come out of denial. Things have to die in order for there to be new life. And so one of the questions for congregations, especially the deeper they're into decline, but even for those who are more at that healthy state, doing the discernment of where is God calling us to next, is to be looking at those questions of what might we need to let go of. A friend of mine always used to say that being on church committees is kind of like being on the mafia. You got off committees the way you get out of the mafia. And sometimes our programs, our ministries in the congregation have that same life cycle of it goes on and on and on and on because we can't end it. Well, sometimes there are things that we do as that its life cycle has ended. And so retiring certain ministries, looking for new opportunities. What is it we need to let go of? Become really important, especially at this stage. So as we think about visioning and discernment work and getting direction, where do we begin? We first begin by listening to God. Again, it's that piece that Carrie talked about as she was talking about, looking at the early church. It begins by engaging in theological reflection, really spending time with one another in reading and talking about the scriptures. Because that helps us understand who God is and who we are and what is it we're called to do. And so I would encourage that whether it be your vestry or bishop's committee or the congregation as a whole, that this discernment process begins with prayer, with scripture, and with reflection. Once that's gotten started, then begin to collect some internal data. Going back to that foundational question of who are we? And this is an opportunity to engage the congregation in reflecting on what are our strengths? What are the ways in which we've been gifted as a community? What are our values that we have? What really shapes us, informs us as a particular community? Part of the internal data also needs to be to take what, if you're in a congregation that's moving or in some place in decline, is also to take that bad news and put it into sharp focus. Because one of the things that helps kind of get folks moving in a direction and toward change is to have a sense of urgency. And one would hope that as we discern ways in which God is calling us, that it's not just a sense of urgency, but it's a sense of holy urgency. That God is about things here, and God needs us to be about God's work here, and that there's a sense of urgency to that. And once you get a sense of what's the internal data, both the good and the bad, is to start looking externally. That question of who's our neighbor. Eric mentioned that every church is getting a couple of thumb drives. There's lots of information on those thumb drives, including all of the resources that Carrie mentioned about today and plenty of other ones. What's also on those thumb drives is for each congregation, the national church chart for your specific congregation and the 3-mile demographics for your particular congregation. And so one of the things that to start looking at is who's out there in our community. Because communities change, and so we sometimes think that, gee, we look like this, when in fact over the last 10 years, 20 years, what have you, the community might have changed significantly. So, is your community increasing its population of older people? What's the rate of young families moving into the area? Or what's the rate of young couples, not so young couples, having children? Who's around? And to get a sense of that. I can't remember what congregation I was with recently, but we were talking about how after World War II, a significant Asian population began to develop in that community. And so that's a change. What are the needs of the community? How is it we begin to understand those? And how is it we even begin to find out? And so again, the Carrie mentioned about doing neighborhood walks and prayer walks, the relational one-on-one meetings with your neighbors, with other with other organizations around, helps you understand what are the needs that people have. Also, sometimes the best person to talk to find that out is talk to a social worker. in terms of getting a sense of what's the community like and what's happening. And also to ask that question of, if Jesus were wandering around your neighbor, or around your town today, around your neighborhood, where would he be? Who would he be hanging out with? What would he be noticing? So if you start with the biblical and theological reflection of what does it mean to be the church and who are we, and then begin to gather data, you'll start getting the questions, because you'll begin to see in broad brushstrokes, we're here, this is the mission field out here. What are the questions that are beginning to emerge for us? And a reminder from the former Archbishop of Canterbury that the church is the only society that exists primarily for the benefit of those who are not its members. And so again, churches that are growing, that have a keen sense of direction, are churches that are outwardly focused. They identify who they are called to serve, and they go out. It's not a, we're going to make ourselves attractive and then we're going to wait for people to come and find us. And as we think about who's out there, there are some questions to ask in terms of who is our neighbor. What does it mean? What must I do to inherit eternal life? What does Jesus tell the rich young man?
Sell all his possessions and give it to the poor.
Right. And he also says, love God, love your neighbor. And sell all your possessions and give it to the poor. Gospel of Luke also, that young man asks, who is my neighbor? And Matthew's gospel makes it real clear who our neighbor is. So these are questions that we as congregations ought to engage in. Who is out there? And how is it we begin to connect with them? One of the things that Carrie talked about, and this is one of your handouts too, in the packet that we distributed, in the reading from the first chapter of Acts, about go out from Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria to the ends of the earth. So as we think about that model for understanding also who is out there, who is our neighbor, where might God be calling us? The first thing is to remember that Jerusalem is us. And so in your handout on the page that has these 4 areas, there's some discernment questions for you and for your congregation to think about. It's a 1-page sheet beyond the stapled ones. But this is us. These are the folks who are showing up to church that we know, we're in relationship with. We know their names, we know their stories. And so this is an opportunity to engage with one another about our own faith and ways in which we minister and are present to one another.
This is what it looks like.
Yes, thank you.
So it's right behind,
It's right behind the first statement of bench. So those questions there at the beginning. What are our gifts? What do we value? What are our hopes and dreams? Helps us explore what it means to be Jerusalem. The next field, Judea, this is the area of sameness. Yeah. The area of sameness is that next outer ring of Judea. These are the people who are like us, but they're not necessarily connected with the church yet. Or if they are, they may become only on Christmas and Easter. But they're people that we would be really comfortable with. They're people that if they showed up to church, we could have a really great conversation with because our lives are similar. So it could be people who are from the same, that share the same culture, the same ethnicity, the same socioeconomic background, etc. Lifestyles are very similar. One of the things to think about, though, with this group is how it is we welcome them. And I can say, working in the church for a long time, and that includes being on staff of a couple of parishes, it's really easy for us, and I can say I'm guilty of this, to get really snarky of the Christmas and Easter crowd if they only show up once or twice a year. And when I catch myself doing that, it's kind of like, what kind of message are we perhaps even tacitly giving people? Are we being judgmental that they're only showing up to church once or twice a year? Or are we really genuinely providing a welcome for them? And so that's, I think, a challenge for churches to think about how it is we welcome those who are similar. The Sumerians, metaphorically, this is the area of difference. These are the people who are not like us. These are the people that we don't have a lot in common. These are the folks that perhaps if we spend some time around, we're kind of uncomfortable. Maybe they live in an area of town that we don't like to go to. But they are in some way different. And so, who are they and what makes them uncomfortable? And what does the gospel call us to be in relation? How is our relationship to look with them? Let me give you an example of a congregation in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. A number of years ago, we were doing some visioning work, and they realized that they were a congregation that was mostly white, well-educated, certainly middle class. Most of the people were either retired or employed. And most of the people, that congregation was not in their neighborhood. They drove to that church. They realized that their neighbor was their Sumerians. With a big old apartment building the next block over from the church, primarily of people of color, primarily a lot of single moms with kids, low income, and they realized that they were doing their whole life in being church, pretending that that whole block right next door to them just didn't exist. That was their Samaria. And so one of the things that they realized that the gospel was calling them to live into was to in some way be in relationship with their neighbors. But that was a huge leap for them. And then the last category are the folks at the ends of the earth. These are folks we'll never know their names, we don't know their faces. They might geographically be on the other side of the world. They also might be on the other side of town, especially if you live in larger areas. But when you think about the work that congregations do through Episcopal Relief and Development or whatever, those are ways in which we connect with people who are perhaps at the ends of the earth. But that kind of helps us think about the mission field. And so as congregations engage in that question of who is my neighbor, we need to be thinking in kind of these categories and realizing that even though the concentric circle is further out, they may geographically be very close.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Good.
Yeah.
Just a couple more things and then Joanne will be up. So welcoming an emerging vision. First of all, it's important to remember that vision comes from God. It is not so much something that we create as something that we receive, that we welcome it. So again, when Carrie was talking about that, what was really key about churches that are growing is that they're communities that are rooted in prayer, and that is intentional at the center of their identity. Because prayer is primarily about attentiveness to the movement of God. And so, so discernment work and the work of visioning is to be open to and attentive to what God is calling us. The second thing is to remember that it takes time. And matter of fact, the further down a congregation is in that decline slope, the more time they ought to take really doing some discernment. And not rush that. So engage, for the congregation to engage for a period of time in Bible study and reflection and beginning to really understand who we are and who our neighbors are and what does that mean? What is beginning to emerge out of that information? It takes time. Matter of fact, some books on redeveloping congregations will actually say that this period of time churches ought to be spending anywhere between 12 to 24 months. I mean, a chunk of time in ways that often we are not very patient with. So even if your congregation doesn't have that much patience, again, to realize this is not something that's going to happen on a Saturday morning. And to remember that for vision to have power, it's got to somehow connect with our deep longings and connect with our call and who God is calling us to be. And we'll talk a little bit more in a minute about ownership, but that's really important. And so one of the things that's key with both the taking the time and the having the ownership is to resist the temptation of pulling out of the filing cabinet the mission and the vision statements that were done by vestry, 12 years ago. Because that's not who you are anymore, and you also don't have ownership of that. It doesn't necessarily speak to the congregation. It's also not helpful to just say, oh, these are the buzzwords today. Inclusivity, welcoming all, we're going to use that. Because again, if that's not who you are at this point, or where the congregation is going to take ownership, they're just nice words on the page. So vision has some important functions. When you think about the importance of having a vision. First of all, it has to be compelling because it has to invite us into imagining the possibility of a new reality. We have to somehow glimpse the kingdom of God in that vision. Another important part of having a vision is that we all hit hard times. In our communities, we hit hard times. And so a vision is a sustaining voice. It is an image that strengthens. It can serve or should serve as a compass. And it should provide us guidance as we make decisions. So that question that Joanne asked, does your vision, does your mission and your vision really drive the work of your congregation? It should. That's what keeps kind of getting us, make sure we're moving in the direction that we discern that God is calling us and inviting us into. So a couple things about articulating a vision, and then we'll get to some more of the practicalities. First of all, it's important to engage people in dialogue about ways that God may be calling the church. One of the resources that's on the thumb drive that each congregation has gotten is a piece called, if I remember correctly, Who Speaks for Soul? And it's an article that basically says, kind of how visions get articulated can come from different places. It can come from the leader of a congregation. It can come from the priest, the pastor, or a single individual. It can come from a small group. So it could be the vestry, it could be a strategic planning committee, it could be a search committee that does that work. Or it could be the entire congregation, the entire community. The larger the group gets, the messier the process can be, and the more time-consuming it's going to be, but the more ownership there is to the vision. If it's just one person saying, this is the vision, this is what God is calling us to do, and y'all come along and follow us, we're going to do this, you're not necessarily going to have a lot of buy-in. And so congregations that are really willing to take the time to, as a community, engage in this conversation and this reflection of what does it mean to be the church today, and who are we, and who is our neighbor, that as a vision emerges, there's going to be more sense of ownership. We've already kind of touched on using scripture to ground the conversations, that piece of Carrie saying, really being rooted in the gospel. Honoring people's input, and it's important that leadership stays open and curious. We want to be receptive. We want to be looking at what are the possibilities, and then providing multiple opportunities or contexts that people can go ahead and participate. And I think articulating the direction. Mission statements and vision statements. First of all, I'm going to encourage you not get bogged down into semantics. But mission statements are statements of identity and purpose. Who are we? They're generally brief, concise, hopefully memorable. But there's two different kinds, axiomatic and unique. An axiomatic mission statement is a mission statement that you could say about Trinity Episcopal Church, you could say about Blessed Sacrament Episcopal Church, you could say about First Methodist Episcopal Church, because it's all of what churches are supposed to do. The prayer book, says we're called to continue to reconcile and work with Christ in the world. Well, that's our mission, but it's not unique to a particular congregation. It doesn't say anything about their contexts. A unique mission statement will speak to a context about who you are particularly and the neighbors that you have been given. If your statement, if you have a fairly general mission statement, then it's going to be really important that the vision, and the vision is really what drives things, is in terms of what's the direction that we're moving in. That ought to be unique. That really ought to be specific to who you are and where you are planted. A vision statement is a word picture of what the congregation would look like, what the world would look like if we actually fulfilled or lived into our purpose. And it can certainly be more descriptive than a mission statement. There's a challenge for churches because we want to make everyone happy. We want to try and be all things to all people. And so one of the challenges for churches as you do this discernment of your direction and your vision, the challenge is you've been looking at lots of different stuff. You then need to begin to discern a specific call. And to claim a meaningful direction. And that's one of the things that as you think about how it is that we live into our vision, that having that degree of specificity is going to be important. So at this point,
Did you want to cover this
Oh.
sheet?
there's one other sheet in there, it's a blue sheet.
There's several blue sheets.
Well, yes, but the first blue sheet. There's a couple more discernment questions that churches can look at. One is an exercise that uses the 7 letters to the 7 churches in Book of Revelation. And as whether it's in small groups or the congregation as a whole, spend some time with those letters, reading them. And then to think, if God were to be writing to your congregation, what would God write to you? What would be your letter if you were one of those churches receiving a letter? For what would we be commended? How would we be challenged? And then the other set of questions are ways to begin to have a sense of, are we owning the vision? Are we owning it and being owned by it? What are the attitudes in the congregation? What's the atmosphere and the mood like if we're living into this vision? What kind of energy is being generated? Are all questions that can kind of come back and test, is this a vision that we have embraced? At this point, questions, comments before Joanne moves on?
It was just,
Yes.
how, you said that for change to happen, it's probably going to be conflict.
Yes.
So how do you handle that conflict?
Come to the workshop this summer.
Okay.
We are doing a series of workshops this year on change and more workshops next year on
Will you
conflict.
let us know when it is?
It's in your
It's in the
packet.
packet.
Oh, okay, good.
But I will say that it's impossible to over-communicate about doing this work with the congregation. So part of what helps to address conflict is it a process that people have been invited to be engaged in, rather than is it something that's being imposed on them? Have their voices been heard in the process? Is really important, and to keep kind of reminding people that God is calling us into something perhaps new, perhaps different. And one of the ways that we get stuck is that, especially for churches in serious decline, we want to change only so much to the point that we can get back to the way we were before we had to change. And some of it is just that there's a lot of grief work that congregations need to do about we need to let go of some things, and we need to kind of name that and have some time to grieve about it. But yes, the conflict piece is a whole nother topic in and of itself. But the more congregations can talk about, keep reminding ourselves of, this is the journey. This is the direction. These are what we've said we value and why we think God is calling us here. And so, whether it's the people of Israel wandering in the desert, they got the promised land over there, but there's a whole lot of grumbling on the way to get there. And we just need to kind of keep reminding ourselves that God has a purpose for us, and we're moving into that. Yes.
When you began talking about vision statements, you mentioned we must first discern a specific call,
Mm-hmm.
and then there was another phrase, another step. I didn't catch that.
That would be our one. Kind of came in that. And, it's that piece of, though, clarifying our identity and discerning a specific call, and to be very particular about it. So, if we just say our mission is to serve all people, that's a real easy one then to let yourselves off the hook, because there's no accountability in it. So going back to that congregation in the Twin Cities, that they said, okay, our specific call, where we really think God is wanting us to be, is in relationship with those people who live in that apartment building, and in ways that we can really be in relationship with them, and not just a matter of giving out a sense of charity. Then that becomes a real specific call, a real specific piece that then you can say, okay, how are we measuring that? How are we doing? Have we really started, to engage with this community that we're in? So that degree of specificity is going to be really important when it gets time to articulating what the direction is. If you leave it wide open, all really nice loosey-goosey, you're likely not to be doing anything or anything different. Anything else?
You said you were gonna let us know when you have those conflict seminars?
It's in your packet, there's a save the date.
Right.
okay.
Yeah, the change ones there, the conflict ones haven't gotten announced
It's a
yet.
half sheet,
Okay,
save
I
the
see,
date.
thank you.
So- I want to just echo some things Kathy said. And the first is, if I say this, can you name who I'm talking about? We try harder. Hurts. So if somebody had that as their mission or vision, then it becomes, what does that mean for us? What does that mean for us financially? What does that mean for us about training or equipping people? And the same is true in the church. What would it mean for us to say, we, whatever, we try harder, we are the best, whatever it is, what will it mean for how we use our resources and our gifts? And that's a kind of specificity. So you start to begin to identify what it means to live into that. How will we be different? So Colin Powell is a hero of mine for many reasons. He's one of the people, if he were to call and say, I need you back, and I was Air Force, not Army. So right there, that's a big concession, because Air Force is number one. But if he were to call and say, I need you to go wherever, I'd be on a plane. We've all, because of the reality, he understands some important things. And to me, we learn from failure. It isn't about getting beaten up for failure, or just saying, well, that didn't work, we're not going to do that again. But learning from failure is essential. And it's essential for us in the church. And that's your note. So, okay, we got the next one up there. So the first thing we have to do is, once we have really begun to think about mission and vision, is to create a plan, to create an action plan. How do you get from where you are right now to where you want to go? Too often in churches, what happens is we create the vision of the mission, and that's the end of it. Nothing becomes of it. There's no accountability, there's no game plan. It is purely a nice document collecting dust on the shelf. And so it's important then to begin to look at, what will it mean? How will we get there? Thank you. So looking at things like what congregations and leaders must commit to. What do they have to make a decision that we will stand behind and live into? They have to look at specific areas where they will work. We can't tackle the whole thing at once. We don't have the kind of resources to begin to say, we're going to have a 20-prong approach to living into this mission. It needs to be prioritized. What is the most important? What are the things we will work on right now? One of the things that we talk about is having a parking lot. So it's not just saying we're not going to even think about the others, but we're going to put them on a parking lot so we don't forget them. And then when we get to working on whatever that area is, we can pull it up and remember. We need to be able to articulate, to really communicate. Kathy mentioned you can't over-communicate. It is true. How many of you have had where it's gone out in the mail, it's gone out on your website, it's gone out any number of ways, and I see Ed smiling right there, and somebody will come up and say, well, I didn't know about it. You can never over-communicate and use every medium possible. Don't get hung up on wordsmithing. That is one of the drawbacks, is we can get so involved in trying to get the exact perfect wording of something that we never get around to doing anything with it. And then goals. How are you going to accomplish what you've set out to do? The who, the what, the when, the cost are all important things. Along with when will, not only when will something happen, but when are we going to check in to find out how it's going? So that accountability. Action plans have to be measurable, achievable, specific, and time limited. So in your packet, you have some samples. They're about Saint Unknown's mission. And so there is one is you have the goal, you have the action, the status, who, and the timeline, and any other comments. These are not items of perfection. This is just things that have been created. You can create it differently. But it's having something you can pull out and go, oh, we need to look at this. We said 2 months ago we were going to, and it didn't happen. Or we need to find out how it's working. The second one is a similar type of thing. It's the task, the steps, what additional information is needed, who's going to do it. That's always key, folks, is who is going to do it. You always want a name. And when does it need to be done by? And then the status.
I just want to chime in here with a comment that a lot of times churches, or particularly vestries, will look at coming up with discerning and coming up with a mission and a vision statement as being the end of the process. It's not.
It's the beginning.
It's kind of the jumping off point, and they become tools to use, but they're not ends in of themselves.
To echo one thing that Kathy also said is, don't move quickly. I've seen this over and over in our visits to congregations, is the desire to fix. So something gets mentioned, and they are off and running, and we're going to fix it this way. Without gathering the information, is it really an issue? Are you fixing the right thing? Are you coming up with the best way to address the issue? It makes us feel good to do something, but if we don't spend time in discernment, we could be fixing the wrong thing. You could be trying to get to Anchorage, and you're going to end up in Aruba. So 2 primary barriers. The way a church is organized. So I want to say some things about this. Vestries in our churches are really kind of the hub and ways of things that happen. Information flows through, that type of thing. There's several ways vestries could choose to operate. One is they can be gatekeepers. They're controlling. Every decision that gets made goes through vestry. Even at some places, probably, what kind of flowers go on or near the altar table. So that's one way. Now, in that kind of system, it's going to be hard to bring about any kind of change or creativity. because it's cumbersome. Am I right? So another one would be permission giving. I still have to go to vestries to be able to do anything creative or new or make significant changes. And then they give me permission. Vestry affirming would be giving some room for various ministry teams to become creative. That they don't have to bring every little thing to vestry, or to the priest, or to the deacon, but that they can begin to say, let's try something, and let people know who need to know, communicate it appropriately, but have permission to make decisions. Tied with that would be an empowering vestry that really does say, you're in charge of children's formation, run with it. Let us know what we need to do to equip you and to support you and to sustain you. So do you see the differences? Think about the impact that kind of leadership has. The second barrier are people who are resistant to change. Do I need to say anything about that? It's just, I was at something and the person said, why is it that the minute you make a suggestion, the automatic response in people is what?
No, we've never done it that way before.
Never done it that way.
Or
We already do it.
We've done it more than once, and we've done it, it didn't work, we're not doing it again, or we've never done it that way.
well, we've always done it this way. You mean we have to do it differently?
So in seminary, one of my professors, there are 38 canons, I still believe in the church. So he came up with 39, 40, and 41. We've never done it that way. We've always done it that way. And we've done it once, it didn't work. Don't ask us to try again. And then later we added another one. We're Episcopalians, we don't do that. So this is a challenge. How do we deal with people who are resistant to change? So does your organization work for you, the structure? Is it functional? So form follows function. So your structures need to be built to meet the needs of your vision. The structure doesn't dictate the vision and how it should function. One of the things when you have commissions and committees, how many people love serving on committees? But if I were to say, we're going to put this group together and work on X project, something you have some interest in, do you hear that differently? You're still a committee, but the name committee holds. So, working groups, ministry teams that really understand what they're about will be critical. Letting go of some of the rigidness that we can build within our structure over time will be essential. Does your structure encourage ownership? That's important. Does your structure provide for openness and creativity? Without openness and creativity, you will be stuck wherever you are. You will not be open to being a new people, to responding to God's call, but you will be stuck. And finally, does it allow for failure? Failure is not bad. We learn more from failure than we do from success. And guess what, folks? No matter how embarrassing it is or frustrating, we'll live through it. Believe me, I had troops who did some pretty bad things, and I was appalled. And I was highly embarrassed, and we highly embarrassed a number of star generals, which you don't want to do. And I survived it. And I got promoted. So I learned a lot about it's okay to fail. provided we don't beat ourselves up, but instead we examine it. What worked? What didn't work? We started a dinner church at the church I was at last, and there was a lot of excitement. But then after about 6 months, it dwindled and clearly needed to not continue. But we gathered at the end with the leaders and we said, okay, what worked? What was good about this? What might we have done differently? What can we take and learn for the future? That's a lot different than saying, well, Jane, you didn't do this, or Joe, you didn't do this, right? So that's the key, is how do we learn from our failures? I'm gonna make sure I'm on the right. She says I can look here and see it. I'm not sure where to look through my glasses to read it. So one thing you can look at, if you have the courage, is your vestry. We have some handouts there that have some ideas for structuring vestries. Both of them have suggested orders. It's one handout for vestry meetings. We're not advocating one over another. We found where I was, and the person, I didn't find this, someone else did, but we found that by moving finance to the end, it worked better. We didn't spend an hour on the finances. We didn't lose all the energy because we were a struggling church, but we began instead with scripture, with checking in with each other, and then moving into information, and more importantly, to what we needed to spend our time on. What was essentially happening. The discussions, and we used a consensus model. If we weren't ready to make a decision, we weren't ready, and it was fine. So we faced a major issue, one that was very controversial. They had started a daycare in hopes, with the impression, having been told that if they did a daycare, it would bring in members and it would bring in money. What do you want to bet that happened? Not at all. We didn't lose members, but we certainly lost a lot of money. It was a very painful decision, though. And so it took us months. But until everyone was on board with closing, we just kept every month talking about it. Where was God calling us to go with this? How do we listen for God's voice? So those are some very useful tools. One of the primary reasons congregations fail to implement their vision is because they put it on the shelf. You get sucked into focusing on things that aren't as important. So I think you have a chart in here. First things first quadrant. And so where people get stuck is, especially in the not important, because it's easier. It's about, I can do a simple fix usually. Let me just return the 20 phone calls and then I'll move on to something else. Let me write some reports. Well, we need to meet because we need to meet. So we had an outreach meeting, an outreach committee, and they did, they had a bunch of different projects. They hated coming together, but they came together every month, and what did they do? They took minutes. And I said to them, why are we meeting? And we had that conversation, and instead of doing formal meetings, we just put together teams to work on the Easter Bunny thing for the daycare, to work on the Love Incorporated meals, the Thanksgiving dinner, those kinds of things. The energy difference was amazing. No longer did we show up to just sit through a meeting because we thought we had to have one. So not putting a lot of energy in the bottom two, but up in the upper. And the most important one is number 2. The preparation, planning, prevention, relationship building, that is key. Okay, I'm being told how much time I have left. let's see. We need to also, the leadership involves specific activities, and that's, narrative bear budget. Okay,
I'm one that, yeah, I'm sorry.
you're ahead of me, okay. Narrative budgets, by the way, how many of you get your budget every year? And it's pages of numbers. Do you read them? Are you on vestry? Okay, if you're not on vestry, do you read them? Are they engaging?
I understand them.
Okay, you
I've been a
understand.
treasurer before, so I know.
To the average person, they tell a story.
They do not tell a story, and yet we are called by God to be people of the story. Moses repeatedly says, remember, do not forget. The stories we carry are essential. So how does our budget reflect the story of our parish? And there are some samples on the thumb drive of how you might do it. It doesn't have to be a 50-page report. It just can be grouped under outreach, worship, and a simple statement about what is it we do.
But it also helps force it. If you look at the budget, could you tell what your mission and vision were? Are you using your resources of the congregation to really work toward the vision? Or does it just look like the same set of numbers that have been published in the budget for the last 10 years? So it kind of helps people look at, if a budget is a theological document, what does it say about our vision?
And an explanation, if you have a line item in your income that says fundraising, an explanation about that.
Right, what is it? What is it? How are you?
Because that's unrealized money, folks.
Yep. Very good. Next one.
So it's another way, again, of getting your mission and your vision in front of people. We talked about utilization of teams and working groups. One of the keys there I have found is whenever, the rule in our parish was that whenever you ask somebody, it had to be done with kind of words like, I'm going to ask you to pray about serving on, doing for a week. And then if you can let me know what you decided. And you do not need to justify your no. I trust that if you have prayed about it and the answer is no, I have no right to question it. How often have you had to tell somebody no and you have to, oh gosh, let me come up with a good reason? Anybody have that? So we want to give people permission to just say no, guilt-free. The other thing is mutual ministry review, and there's information about that on the thumb drive. And what I want to stress on that is that mutual ministry review is not a performance review of your pastor, your priest. Mutual ministry review is looking at the church as a system and asking questions. What is working well? In the packet is one that Jim Gettle put together. He's the canon for congregational life, I think, in the Diocese of Michigan. He and I developed it together, and it's organic. So what needs to be watered? What needs to be pruned? What needs to be fertilized? What needs to die? We don't want to ask that question, but what do we need to let go of? What new seeds do we need to plant? And what harvest do we need to celebrate? Looking at all your ministries in that light versus, well, the rector's doing this, the organist isn't doing this, the choir, and going through and being a critique. This is about how do we begin to discern again where we're called to be. Any questions?
Just about to wrap up for lunch. One thing that Joanne was talking about on structure. A lot of times our vestries are really comfortable and do a lot of work in the management side of things.
Yeah.
the budget, the carrying of the buildings, the property, all of that. Vestries will also have a leadership role, which is really about how it is that we engage the congregation in discerning a vision and in empowering members of the congregation and to live into that vision. And so if the piece around structure and format of vestry meetings, if your vestries have been really focused on a lot on the maintenance management side of things, to look at building in more time to really spend on some of the leadership skills of vestries. And again, there's a piece on the flash drive for each congregation that talks more about kind of the difference between those management and leadership skills. And the piece around how the vestry as leaders help move the congregation forward and living into that vision is really key. And so if the vestry isn't on board with that, the congregation certainly will not be. So just a couple of things, cautionary notes. The cartoon, if you can't read it, it's the Titanic going down. Deck crew rearrangement working group, are you ready? One of the things to think about is it's really easy to think about rearranging the structure and not pay attention to how people are interacting with one another and how people are behaving. And so if you need to look at structure, if people are not dealing with conflict very constructively or communication really well, rearranging the structure, if it does not deal with some of those dynamics, is not going to do a thing for you. And then also is that piece again about decline, is that we like to be in denial about it. Rearranging structure can be a really effective strategy to avoid more difficult work. And so it sometimes is really a necessary piece, but it can also be a little bit of a something that is, oh, we can do this over here and think we're accomplishing what it is we need to do, and it doesn't necessarily do that. And last, to remember that people resistant to change will remain inwardly focused. And again, it's that piece that I said, they want to bring the church back to the time when its survival was not threatened. And that may not be possible. Or if you're going to bring it back to where its survival is not going to be threatened, you won't look the way you did before. And so you have Calvin and Hobbes, nothing is permanent, everything changes. That's the one thing we know for sure in this world, but I'm still going to gripe about it. So, one of pieces of advice at the end of a book on congregational development said that, first of all, you can only control your own behavior and attitude, but don't worry about the weeks or the years. Focus on the days. And so, as you start the day, think about how are you going to show up to that day? What's going to be your attitude? What aspect of God will you reflect in this day? And then during the day, what are you doing and why, to what purpose? And take some time at the end of each day to reflect on what meaning do you assign to it? Where was God in that day? And as congregations begin to do the work of discernment and visioning and have a direction that is going to involve change, if members of the congregation are willing to do this, you all will be transformed. And we'll finish on a note of Anne Lamott, who says, I do not understand the mystery of grace, only that it meets us where we are and does not leave us where we found it. And this piece about visioning is that, again, it is what God invites us into. And to remember that as we go about a journey of who we are and who we're called to minister to, and how we are called to be changed, as sometimes as rocky as that is, that we don't travel that journey alone, and that the grace of God goes with us. I thank you for your attention. Do you have questions or comments before we go to lunch?
Just
Yes.
one comment. You talked about how people interact with one another. And one of the things we've introduced at the cathedral is the format called Agreeing and Disagreeing in Love, which the Mennonites put out. And it's very effective. It gives you a scriptural focus
Yep.
on your relationships as opposed to emotional focus. And I would recommend it highly to you. If you want to know more, I can give you the address where you can get it.
What's it called again?
Agreeing and Disagreeing in Love. We distribute it to the entire congregation.
Is this on the internet or is it on handouts?
No, it's handouts.
Handouts.
Anything else? We were freezing in the room downstairs for the morning, and we've all been boiling this up here. So we're all ready now for lunch and the next.
Where should we leave our things?